Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, I talk creation and the creative process with Makenzie de Armas. In the wilds, how to create your own monster. And in the tavern, how to create your own plot hook. Hey everyone, I hope everyone's having a great day. As you can tell, it's a little bit of a different episode today because it's just me. We're normally a podcast that records on location, which of course has been impossible due to COVID-19. We've been doing our best in order to create great content from afar, but for this week, it's just me on the podcast. But thankfully, I do have a guest. I'm going to be joined here in a little bit by Makenzie de Armas. She's a great independent TTRPG creator. You've seen her stuff all over the DM's Guild. You've seen stuff that she's done on D&D Beyond. You've seen her on various actual plays. There's been different independent projects she's worked on. And we'll get into all of that as we get into the episode. And we talk a lot about the creative process. Before we dive into the interview, just a couple of announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You could find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You could subscribe to us on YouTube if you'd like to listen to the podcast that way. And we would really appreciate it if you would support us on Patreon. This past week we released the document about the deities in our homebrew world of Erick, based heavily off of the Forgotten Realms. But this document canonizes all the forces in the world which try to impact the prime material in that location. And that's available for the patrons up there on Patreon. In addition to the magic items, which are up there, the creation story, which is up there, as well as the document detailing what sets Erick apart from other settings that's publicly available up there on our Patreon. But we really would appreciate your support. It helps us make this podcast better for you each and every day. All right. Well, without further ado, it's about time for us to dive into this interview with Makenzie de Armas. Today, we really just wanted to talk a lot about creation, and that's going to be the entire theme of the podcast after we talk about her creative process and creating lots of different things with her. We're going to be doing the wilds and the tavern segments a little bit different as well. So we hope you enjoy this little bit different take of an episode, and without further ado, let's dive into the interview. Thank you very much for joining us, Makenzie.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Yes, we're really excited to have you on and to talk about all the things that you've done in the D&D community. And for those of you who are unaware out in the Plot Hooks family, let them know who you are and what you do in this TTRPG space.
So I'm Makenzie de Armas, but I also go by Makenzie Lane DA on Twitter. I'm an independent TTRPG content creator. So I've done work with D&D Beyond with the Critical Role Encounters of the Week. I've also done work with Matt Colville and MCDM with both Player's Guide to Capital and Kingdoms and Warfare as a writer and then co-designer for them. I've also done work as the lead writer for The Islands of Sina Una, a upcoming 5e setting based in pre-colonial Filipino mythology. And I also just do a bunch of stuff independently on DM's Guild. So I've done adventures like I've done supplements like Canarl's Candy Compendium, which is 50 magical candies you can put in your D&D games. Just a bunch of stuff.
Yes, absolutely. And you have created a bunch of things in a short amount of time with your professional creative career. And what we really want to discuss today is that process of creation. Every one of you listening out there loves to create in some way, shape, or form. That's what collaborative stories are. It's people working together to create a story, and many of you enjoy creating awesome characters, or homebrewing classes, or subclasses, or items, or races, encounters, or even entirely new settings for your story to take place. And as you've heard right there, You've done quite a little bit of every little bit of that.
Yeah. It's weird because it's like I didn't go into this going, I want to be a D&D creator. But then I ended up being here, and it's super fun, and I love doing all of it. And part of doing it, a part of being in this field, for me at least, is doing a lot of that creation like on stream. And so that's also been a completely wild and wonderful realm of creation and creative spark that I've loved to explore.
And your background being in creative writing,
yes,
what is it about the TTRPG space that's so appealing for you to create in?
Well, I'm a creative writing major with a minor in computer science, so I've always had a little bit of that gearing towards both creative writing and that more imaginative play side, but also a balance with numbers and math. And I've always loved looking at numbers and math and spreadsheets, and I've always sort of been really interested and really fascinated by that. And so TTRPG creation sort of fit both of those niches really well. I also realize when I'm doing a lot of creative writing and doing creative writing at my university, I have a hard time thinking linearly. That's just part of how my brain works. I can't think of linearly. I can't really think of plot lines. But the thing with writing for TTRPG and TTRPG adventures was that I could take things and build them modularly. Take little pieces, make little chunks, and then put them together like Lego bricks. Or build Lego bricks for other people to put together. And that clicked so much more for me naturally and intuitively than just trying to write a story from beginning to end. I could write multiple different endings in multiple different pathways, and I didn't have to worry about necessarily, does B come after A, and that sort of thing. I could just sort of slide things around and make things more modularly and improvise as I go, which freed me up a lot of creativity and helped me break out of a really big creative block I was in when I first started out.
Yeah. Now, is that whenever you're sitting down to create an encounter, an item, an adventure, a setting, whatever you may be, is that generally where you start? You pick maybe a little piece of it to work on, and then maybe another little piece of it, and just kind of use that until you fully flesh out the idea that you want to build?
Yeah, kind of. It depends. It varies between like writing encounters and writing settings and like writing supplements, but they all kind of start out with this, I get an idea or just a concept of something that I just want to build out. It might be like sometimes the concept itself comes to me like fully fleshed out. Like when I was making my candy compendium, I remember just waking up one day and going, Halloween, candy, goblin, candy, yes, go. And that's how that happened. But there were other things like, take the D&D Beyond encounters where I'd get a prompt. It'd be a couple sentences like, the lighthouse in Nicoteranas has been covered by these vine blights. And I'd sort of take that and build out from there and figure out what would be a cool thing for people to see. Okay, then how do they get there? And what are the different pathways they can get there? How can they look around the environment and discover what's going on? And sort of figuring out those little bits and pieces and sort of building out from a core. Yeah. And building out those multiple layers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one thing which is really key to learn as we're creating, because I think we can end up with decision paralysis so easy because we're talking about a game in Dungeons & Dragons and just role-playing games in general where the only limit is your imagination, where you literally are sitting down not in front of a Monopoly board where there's only so many different things you can do and only so many choices you can make. Your vast array of options on any given subject is so large, it can just be very difficult to actually narrow down and create. And that process of actually dividing it up into chunks and actually figuring out based off of your ideas or your concepts and working through and getting everything together can really help you narrow down and help you with the creative process.
Yeah, and it also helps me avoid the trap of, oh God, what if the adventurers do this? Well, I didn't account for that possibility. Or what if they do this? And it's very freeing to go, it doesn't matter how they get to this point, but they will probably get to this point. So it doesn't necessarily matter how you stack the blocks, as long as you just know the blocks are there for them to play with however they want.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we wanted to go through today several different types of things that we create in Dungeons and Dragons, and things which you've created publicly in the TTRPG space, and just kind of pick your brain on this creative process. So I guess starting from the broadest of all is creating an entire setting. Coming up with an entire place to run a game. And you, of course, are the lead writer for the Islands of Sinauna.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So the Islands of Sinauna is a whole D&D 5e setting that is built around pre-colonial Filipino mythologies. So it's the legends and the history and a lot of the beliefs that my ancestors held on to, being Filipino myself, and sort of exploring these cultures and these traditions that have been lost to time and lost to colonization, and sort of bringing them out and looking at these elements of fantasy that don't usually get explored in most traditional mainstream D&D productions, and getting to build them out in a way that brings these portions of the team's past into a way that we can engage with them in the present. And it's a little bit of like bringing the mechanics to the legend, but a lot of it is just reading into these legends and looking at all these amazing stories and beliefs they had, and realizing, and the translation into mechanics has been fairly easy, because we always just take, in Dungeons and Dragons, it's a lot of like, it's easy to go like, okay, that's a dragon, in terms of, it has the bat wings, and it breathes fire, or it breathes ice, or whatever. And it's really freeing to go, well, we don't have maybe that kind of dragon, but we have something that is at its core, and at its core base of storytelling, and the reason why that myth exists is very similar to what a dragon in Europe was. So it's very easy to go, okay, these mechanics we can fit them in here, and we don't have to exist in the boundaries of what we think a dungeon or a dragon is. We can work beyond that.
That's awesome. You mentioned the translation into the mechanical elements of the game. Was it difficult in terms of the overall feel? Because I think so often we can end up in D&D, no matter the setting, we fall back into generic high fantasy. Nothing wrong with that, absolutely. Wonderful place to tell stories. But what was it like mixing just the traditional, high fantasy elements that are built into the game at its core with these real life legends and lore and all these things from mythology?
Well, I talk about mechanics mostly because when I was lead writer for the setting, I did a lot of work, or I still do a lot of work with the subclasses. When you're creating a setting, it's not just creating the maps or the cities. When you create a full D&D setting, it includes the subclasses, the monsters, the magic items, the spells, and all of that sort of stacking onto each other. That's the part of the book that I dealt a lot with, mostly hands-on. I did a little bit of the setting writing as well, but for most part, I really got my hands into building the mechanics. And I know it was really hard starting out, trying to figure out how to translate what we think of a wizard or a warlock or a rogue, and trying to figure out what kind of subclass would fit in this setting. How do we translate what we think of as a person who makes a pact with an otherworldly entity? How does that work in this world? How does that translate? What kind of entities would you make a pact with, and how would they differentiate each other? I love warlocks, playing warlocks in D&D. It's my favorite class, but I remember having such a hard time trying to design for it, because the warlock subclass is built on this idea that the thing you're making a pact with, you may not always know what it is or know what their end goal is. You make a pact with it, and maybe you know its name, but you don't entirely know why they made a pact with you or what their end goal is as a higher entity. You're just sort of stuck there. But in this world, there aren't really any entities that are that massive and also very mysterious. We have these very big, powerful entities, but their goals are very obvious, and their powers are very obvious. They are beings of immense power, and they are greatly feared among the islands. and you can make a pact with that. But how does that change the dynamic of a warlock when you know you've made a pact with something that is going to end the world, and you know what that creature's goal is, and you know you have been roped into that? How does that shape the kind of mechanic set that you build around that, and how does that shape like the invocations? How do you differentiate between those same entities but who have the same goal but for different reasons and different stylizations? And that was something that was super hard but also super rewarding to build in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. That's always the hardest things, which are the most rewarding in the end. Absolutely.
Oh yeah, that took me, I was staring at that page for so long going, I don't know how to do this. Oh God. Oh no. Help. How am I supposed to? I love warlocks. This should be easy. Designer.exe is stopped working.
Yes, exactly. I know exactly what you mean. It's hard enough creating a setting for non-public consumption. I can't imagine doing it for, things that people are going to actually be looking at.
And then there's a lot of it with Sina Una especially, is like we have to do research because it is based on real myths, and we want to make sure we honor those myths respectfully, and we honor our own heritage respectfully, and we make sure we do read into the myths and really get into the reasons why these myths exist, and not just do like a surface level, okay, well they had this, and it looks like a dragon, so we'll just stick a dragon on it. There we go, it's done.
Yeah.
And so that's been the biggest, not necessarily struggle, but the thing that has made writing for Sina Una different than I think writing for homebrew settings or other things, where I've actually had to do so much research, and I've enjoyed doing so much research, but I can't just say, yep, there's a casino there, or there's a road there, that's what the city looks like. I've had to actually look and be like, what do these cultures do, and really get into the nitty-gritty of it. And I think it's like rippled out into a lot of my other creation, where I've actually gotten to like the root of why certain things exist in like my subclasses and stuff. But that's definitely something that I didn't expect going into the project that has been really eye-opening for me.
Yeah. And do you think that research is something that's helpful to do no matter what, even if the setting is not necessarily based off of something real world, but just based off of, another flavor of a traditional fantasy trope? Do you think that's research is something that actually can aid you in actually making your world feel authentic?
Yes, but I also hesitate to call it research because that makes a lot of people go, no, I don't want to do it. That's like studying, and that's boring. I think there's a lot to be... I definitely think, like, when you want to build your own setting, you should look at the things you love, and look at why they work and why they don't work, and be able to deconstruct them down and really understand, okay, I like this style of fantasy. Why do I like it? What makes that type of fantasy really stick and like sing to me? What about like this movie that I love? What is it at its core that makes it my happy place? And being able to critically sort of deconstruct the media you like into its narrative bits and bobs, and then being able to go, I like this. This is the thing I like. Let me see how I can put that into D&D. And that's something that a lot of us do already when we're building things, but to be conscious of that process and really look into things and really dig into, okay, what did this writer that I admire, what was their inspiration? How did they draw inspiration from it? And also, it also helps when you're trying to break tropes. When you research, I like this trope, or I don't like this trope. Why does this trope exist? And then looking into why it exists, so you can start from the bottom and rebuild it, and rebuild something that avoids that trope but doesn't feel like just your surface fixing it. Like one of the examples I think of when I think of that is the idea of the patriarchal matriarchal society. And so a lot of times when people they want to skew the trope of the patriarchal society, they just make a matriarchal society, but they just flip who has what roles. So the women are always like the hunters and the fierce warrior types, when the men are expected to stay home. And that on the surface level flips the trope, but at the same time, on its deeper narrative core, doesn't actually do a lot to rework the narrative structure and the narrative ideas that trope is built on. And so being able to do research into why those tropes exist and tearing them apart and being able to rebuild on top of them is really good for helping to break tropes and create new things, as well as being inspired by the old.
narrowing it down just a little bit from creating an entire setting.
Yes.
Creating an adventure or a campaign arc if you're just in the middle of a longer extended campaign. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like having that theme or that idea would be really useful in getting you started here. You, of course, did, as you mentioned earlier, I've Been, the best-selling adventure on the DM's Guild, and that explores mental health so much and finding understanding and empathy with those that are undergoing mental health struggles. And I imagine that generated from a desire to create a campaign based off of that concept.
Yeah, a lot of it came off of the idea that we like to pretend mental health is something that we can defeat, like a monster, and then never have to deal with ever again. You slay the dragon, it's dead, it never comes back, we can move on with our lives. And I remember that when I had got the idea for the adventure, I had hit another depressive spiral. I had come out of a really bad mental health crisis at the beginning of 2019, and I was doing really well, and I was super proud of myself, and I was like, yeah, I did it! I defeated my problems! I'm okay! And then something happened, and I remember spiraling back down and sitting in my apartment kitchen going, this sucks! Feeling like that idea of, it's never gonna go away, is it? Like, I'm gonna have to fight this forever. And realizing that idea and that feeling I had and having to tell myself it's okay that it comes back. And then that recognition that other people might want to hear this too. And so that's kind of where that idea came from. And it was really thanks to the RPG Writers Workshop, because that was a month-long boot camp to writing an adventure, and I don't think I would have been able to complete it without that framework around it, because having the boot camp around it basically forced me to complete it in a month and not shy away from talking about it, and that definitely helped.
Yeah, it's such an important topic to discuss, and something that you're exactly right. It isn't something that you defeat. And I enjoy that role-playing games are healthy spaces where we can explore those narratives. And it really helps me with empathy and being able to put myself in the shoes of someone who's dealing with this mental health issue. And what is that like? What are my interactions with other people like? And it just helps us put ourselves in other people's shoes.
Yep. I think when you're designing an adventure, especially, it's very easy to get caught up in the fantasy part of fantasy role-playing game, but the role-playing part is just as important, and building a story that maybe isn't necessarily super fantasy, but really lets you get into these characters and really get into the viscera of the adventure, that brings the fantasy to life just as much as seeing a dragon soar across the sky or watching a beholder rise up from a pit from the ground. Having to face those manifestations of self-loathing and anxiety and depression and being able to, in the fiction, confidently say, I recognize that I have these thoughts and I don't like myself, but that's okay because I have friends who will help me get through this and help me fight it when it gets tough. Being able to say that in the fiction makes it a lot easier to say it in the real world. And that's always been my experience with playing games and being in the community, being able to say in fiction, like, I'm terrified. I don't know what I'm doing. And having friends in fiction say, you're going to be okay, you're brave and you're wonderful. And then being able to take that confidence from in-game to outside of the game has been really wonderful and opening. And I love being able to facilitate those sorts of realizations through the things I create. Even if they aren't as most explicitly mental health related as I've been, I love looking at things that explore those sorts of relationships and really lean into that interpersonal nature of role-playing games.
Absolutely. And it is a role-playing game. I love that point. That's an excellent idea. If you're creating an entire adventure or campaign arc, you can easily make it feel, quote unquote, more fantasy if that's what you desire, by just throwing one of those tropes, like a dragon, like a beholder, like just having the characters that play in the game be a more high fantasy type character, and all of a sudden it feels very high fantasy, but the actual core of it is this much more meaningful, rich, full, deep narrative, which, you know, can create some really fulfilling and interesting opportunities for storytelling.
Yep 100%.
Narrowing down further from a setting to an adventure to an encounter.
Yes.
This, of course, is something that every DM has to do prior to every session, whether or not they even know if the players are going to even turn in that direction. But you, of course, wrote several encounters leading up to the release of Explorer's Guide to Wildmount earlier this year. You can find them on D&D Beyond. And you said you got started with that. You kind of received a prompt, and you just kind of built it out from there?
So, in the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, I don't know which chapter number it is, but in the chapter that's the Gazetteer, each area of Wildmount, each city, and each, I think, not necessarily smaller than a region, but if not necessarily a city, so like woods or those sections, they have a couple of plot hooks that are already provided in the book. They're maybe a sentence or two long, and they do provide a little bit of what kind of level adventure it might generate. So, it'll be something like, under the Rexcentrum section, it's like, the characters intercept a plot to assassinate the king. No one believes them, but it's true what happens. And it's just something very small like that. And so both me, Latia Jaquez, and James Hake, who were all writers on that project, had taken some of these small plot hooks and then fleshed them out into encounters, not necessarily to show, like, this is what should happen, but to more show the possibility space of what you can do. So I took, like, one of the Nicodranas blurbs called Vineshine, which was about the lighthouse being covered by these dark vines and the adventurers encountering vine blights. And then I said, well, what could cause these vine blights? What might have happened? And so I started building out from there as one of the many possibilities you could have in your game when playing in that setting. It was just more of an example of what you can do, and a good starting point for people who maybe feel overwhelmed with the amount of information packed into that setting. And so it also was a cool way to show off a bunch of different areas and small bits and bobs of Wildmount without, like, dumping the full book on people.
Yeah. I think that's something that I've learned in my own personal dungeon mastering as well, is that it's okay to use those plot hooks and other ideas from other people. I think when we all get started out, we think we're supposed to be this smart person who homebrews everything.
Oh God,
and we're sitting in front of our computer trying to come up with all this information. When you can just go to the Dungeon Master's Guide and roll on a D100 table if you like. There's nothing wrong with that, and you don't have to necessarily take exactly what it is. But hey, maybe the item that you rolled was a spell scroll, and you're like, oh, that's awesome. Oh, this scroll would be useful if maybe it wasn't this spell, maybe it was this spell instead. And you can get ideas from doing stuff like that. And that's completely fine, just to take those plot hooks and just build them out. Yeah, no, it's we love a good random roll table. It's great, and it's always so good to just have that freedom to go, this, I don't know where to start. I have no clue where to start, and just admitting that and being able to get a launching off point, because sometimes that's all you need to just sort of get the ball rolling, and there's no, you don't have to be 100% original all the time. I know there's a lot of pressure to be like, I have to make an entire world from scratch, otherwise I'm not a good dungeon master, and that's like not the case at all. Do that if you want to, but you don't have any pressure to do that if you just want to like have fun. And there isn't even a lot of pressure to build out the world beyond what you see in the encounter. It's like existing in a photograph. You can have like, you see in the photograph, you see the mountains in the background, but they're all kind of fuzzy, and we don't know what's beyond like the borders of that frame, and you don't really have to focus on what's beyond the borders of the frame yet until after the encounter, and even then you can build them out step by step by step. You don't have to know everything as the dungeon master, and I think that really helped me sort of take a lot of pressure off me when I was first learning how to DM, and I think that's something that a lot of people starting out feel a lot of pressure to do or to know, but you can have a little bit of an ambivalent objects in your encounter and not know why they're there just yet, but figure them out as you go. It's also totally okay to steal ideas from your players if they're like, well, maybe it's this thing, and you're like, it is this thing. Yes, you're right. Yes. You're right, it is. Fourthly, you have just creating a character. And this is what all of us do, even if we're just starting out. It's our first instance with encountering Dungeons and Dragons or another role-playing game. We all have to create a character. We all have to come up with backstories, no matter how deep it is. We all have to come up with classes. And you, of course, your first kind of foray into the public scene was with one-on-one, when you ran as your solo character, Bree Nightwalker.
Yeah.
What's your starting point when you write your own characters? Because so much of the stuff that you do now publicly is about creating things for other people to play in.
Yeah.
But whenever you're playing yourself, what's your starting point?
Well, I think it's really interesting you bring up Bree, because I think my character creation process from when I had created Bree has changed so much since I've started playing, because Bree was the second D&D character I've played, technically, and the first I'd played for more than, 2 sessions. And I remember when I had created Bree, I had this idea of, in the player's handbook, there's a brief mention under cleric that's like, how did you become a cleric? Were you very willing about it, or did your god just choose you and place you on this path? And I loved the idea of having a really reluctant, unhappy cleric who just really hated her god. And that's what I played, and that's who Bree is. She's someone who was chosen to be a cleric and just doesn't want to be a cleric. Didn't want to be chosen as a vessel for the protector god of her world. But the protector god is like, I need you, and I like you, so go, do the thing. And so she's just kind of very confusedly trying to figure out how she fits into the world. And I think, I remember with Bree, I had a very, very, very deep and complex story arc, which worked really well for one-on-one because it was just me and my partner working together. As I started playing more games, all kind of on stream, but with more people involved, I remember taking a little bit of pressure off the backstory. For a long time, I loved cramming as many secrets as I could into someone's backstory. But in my more recent games, I've realized that while I like having characters who have secrets and who have things to be revealed and to be discovered, I like providing gaps. Because if I know everything about my character's backstory, then I, as the player, can never be surprised. And that's not fun. I like being surprised and learning and exploring about the world. And it's harder to do that when you put so much pressure on your backstory to carry everything. It's so much fun to let yourself sort of explore as that character and learn things about yourself, both in-game and yourself playing the character. And getting that chance to explore a little bit and have a little bit of freedom and make a flexible sort of backstory. If I was playing Bree right now, I would have taken so much out of her backstory that I had made. I'd packed so much into her backstory. And it all ended up going into the world lore, but I think if I had created her now, I would have only had a couple of those things and just left everything a lot more free-flowing, just to let her breathe a little bit more and explore more.
Yeah.
And I know when I do eventually go back to playing her, I have fiddled around a little with her character sheet with some of the UA options, but in terms of narrative, I'm really pulling back some of the things I had originally planned to throw in her backstory. And when we do eventually get to that point where I get to play her again, I'm really excited to see how much I've grown and how much my style of play and creation has changed.
Yeah, and it does certainly change. We all learn every single time we're at the table, don't we?
It's so wild to think, I've only been playing D&D for 2 years? Barely 2 years. 1.5-ish. And to see how much my style has changed since when I first started playing Bree, who was my first long-term character, to I'm in the middle of creating a character for an upcoming long-term campaign on a stream, and how much my creation process between those two has changed. I still have characters who have secrets, but the way I've developed them out and how I incorporate those secrets, they're not as determined or locked in place in backstory anymore. I've left so many gaps that I can fill in later that even we might go into during game and go into a flashback. I want to leave those sections open to play in.
Awesome. Well, the final two little areas of creation that there are to discuss are a little bit more numbers heavy, because here you get into the interacting a lot more with the mechanical elements of the game, and that's creating classes and creating magical items.
Yeah.
Those two things are, it's one thing to just come up with settings and adventures, but a lot of those things, a lot of it's in the abstract. You're just coming up with concepts and what things look like, what things feel like, different kinds of things like that. But whenever you get into actually brewing classes, subclasses, magical items, those are things which are very hard, I think, to do, and people shy away from sometimes because they are afraid of the difficulty of balance with the creation of those elements, and again, sometimes they're just not sure where to start. And I know I am that way with my own things like that. You've obviously had some experience in that arena. I guess let's take magic items first. You mentioned it earlier, Canarl's Candy Compendium. You just had that brilliant idea out of thin air?
Basically what had happened was, this was right after I'd finished I've Been, I think had just hit Copper bestseller, and I was super excited, and then I remember going, shoot, what do I do next? I did that, it's done, and it hit bestseller, now what? And I just remember feeling this overwhelming panic, especially because Halloween was coming up, and I don't regard myself as a very spooky person. I'm small, I have chubby baby-faced cheeks. I'm just not a spooky person. I just don't do spooky. So I was really concerned because I was like, I don't know what to produce. And then I remember just thinking about, well, what other things are part of Halloween? Candy, okay. What would make a book of candy cool? What if it was narrated by a tiny goblin child? I don't know where the goblin child part exactly came from, but it just sort of... It was this preformed idea that just popped into my head, and I was like, okay, tiny goblin child who knows way too much about candy? Yes. And then I just sort of ran with it, but the actual generation process of creating the candy itself was exhausting, and I don't think I could look at a candy for about 2 months afterwards. I had done so much... Again, going back to what we talked about research, my Amazon search history was absolutely screwed for, like, the next month after that product was made, because I was just looking at so many different things, like, what kind of candy is there? What do people like to eat? What are some what actually kinds of candies do people consume or make? Because it's like, when you think of candy, it's like, oh yeah, I know candies. Then you actually have to sit down and think about, like, what kind of candies you can eat, and then you set out to make 50 different ones that none of them can be quite the same. It's so... It gets daunting and overwhelming, and I definitely jumped into the deep end with that. I would not recommend starting out with doing that, but it was super fun nonetheless.
Well, and of course, in your world, you do not have to create 50 magical items if you do not wish to. You can create just one that might suit your needs.
You don't have to create 50. You don't have to. I mean, you can if you want to, and you think it'll be fun, and it's something that you enjoy. Go for it. I will say 50 seems like a little until you're at candy number 26, and you're like, oh, I don't know how many more of candies I can do, and how many more things I can do with candies, and trying to mess around with that. I think for me, a lot of it was like what you'd said, very mechanical, crunchy, and trying to figure out, like, you see the Willy Wonka candies and you're like, oh, that candy makes you fly, and then you actually have to sit down and go, how does that work in D&D action economy? How long does it take for you to, like, eat a candy that makes you fly? Do you have to keep it in your mouth or maintain concentration on it? What kind of rarity would it be? How long should it last in terms of, like, how pricey the item is for, like, to buy, and then when you eat it, how long does that flight capability last? And trying to measure that out. I remember there were a couple of candy items that ended up, I think, in the rarest, the very rare candy items. One of the first ones I had created was this idea of these sugar animals based off of Chinese sugar art. And I remember being super excited about the idea of having, like, a flying caramel dragon just sort of soaring in the air around your character. But then having to actually sit down and go, what does this dragon actually do? How do I mechanize what a caramel dragon can do? Does it breathe fire? Does it breathe caramel? Does it breathe spicy caramel? How much damage does spicy caramel do? And how long does it take to breathe spicy caramel? And it's those, like, these little things that they're such a pain to think about during the process, but they help them feel so much more integrated and real in your D&D world if they have these little, these very specific things. If it's like, yeah, it does 2d6 fire damage, but the flavor text around it saying it spews a ball of molten caramel every bonus action, it's like, oh, that makes it feel so much more active and alive. And those are a lot of things that I think magic items need, that sort of a mix of flavor text and also mechanics that help make it come alive without feeling too generic or also feeling too complicated. I know a lot of times when we make magic items, it's a lot of, I want the mechanics to do this specific thing, and I want to build mechanics that do that. And there are systems that are good for that, but D&D itself is not good for breaking mechanics to make them how you want. D&D itself is so mechanic heavy on the back end that it's really hard to like bend and break the mechanics to fit exactly what you want. For me, I've always found the best ways to figure out what mechanics already exist and then changing the narrative text around it to give it a different flavor or a different color. Or combining two mechanics that you normally wouldn't see together, but putting them together and seeing how they mix and match. That happens a lot in subclasses, which you also mentioned.
Yeah, and speaking of the subclasses, this is perhaps even more daunting than magical items, again, in just terms of there's even more mechanical things to think about in terms of just, just an item that does one thing or a small selection of things. You have this class that you are building out that is going to take a character through several sessions of from levels 1 to 20, and you have to figure out what comes what and what's too powerful and what's not, and you mentioned, of course, that you're involved a lot in the subclasses with the Islands of Sina Una.
Yes.
What's that look like, whenever you're starting to create a subclass or an entire new class system?
Yeah. Well, I don't have as much experience building full classes. My sort of bread and butter has always been subclasses. I always find the subclasses, they're not necessarily easy for me, but I think because I love creating characters so much and I'm a very character-focused player, and like I mentioned earlier, I love like getting into the nitty-gritty of characters. I think subclasses work better for me because every subclass that you see in the PHB or in Xanathars or really anything, a lot of the more like famous ones and the ones that people gravitate to, they exist with a narrative through line. There's a reason why they exist. Like for like an assassin, okay, this is a character who is really good at being a silent killer. Or like for bards especially, it's like, okay, a college of swords bard is a gladiator, a showman, like a circus performer who can swallow swords. That's kind of their narrative drive. And then especially with warlocks, so it's like, okay, you've made a pact with an archdevil, you've made a pact with an angel. That's their through line. And that's kind of what I do for all of my subclass design, is I figure out what kind of character trope or character arc do I want people to be able to play with this subclass? How do I help people tell stories through the mechanics that I provide them? And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck on building subclasses. They get stuck on the idea of, I want the subclass to do this thing mechanically. But if you just have the mechanics and you don't have a good story to mesh with it, the mechanics sort of feel clunky and it's hard to remember what needs to go where. If you can figure out, I want a subclass that represents this. The one subclass I actually have a bunch of subclasses on DM's Guild, but the most recent one, Pneumomancy, was essentially, I want to do a subclass that is built around love. I want to build a love subclass that doesn't deal with enchantment magic or doesn't take the normal tropes that we associate with like deities of love or control or that sort of path. I want to create a subclass that really focuses on the idea of love being a bond between people. How do I convey that narratively? And how do I convey how much I care and love and want to protect my friends and family into mechanics? And so that's kind of what the through line for that subclass was. And if you look at a lot of the abilities, they're all about like making a bond with another player character. And yeah, there's some narrative flavor text about like tying string around each other's finger and stuff, sort of playing into that fantasy element. But when you break it down to the mechanics, it's that sort of give and take of giving some of your hit dice to heal them, or boosting their AC, or giving them advantage with, I think, ability checks or something along those lines. And those little things that help, when you build them on top of the narrative, they form a coherent story as you're reading the subclass. And I think that's something I love, and something that really catches my eye when I see subclasses, is they tell a story of a character developing over time. And that's what a subclass should be. It should be almost like a template, almost like Mad Libs, where you can fill in the blanks with your own character's special things, but it provides a template for a story that you can tell.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate you stopping by on the show.
Thank you so much for having me and letting me blabber on for an hour about my creative process, which admittedly sometimes doesn't make sense, but it's super fun to talk about anyways.
No, absolutely. We appreciate it. One more time, just tell everybody where they can find you if they want to check out the stuff that you are involved with and find where you're at on social media and otherwise.
Well, most of the time you can find me screaming into the void on Twitter at Makenzie Lane DA. That's spelled MakenzielAneda. That's usually where I am. You could also find me as a moderator and player over on the Scraticus Academy, where I run D&D, and then I also play in other various games here and there. It's super fun, and it's a really awesome place to get learning and exploring and creating and really getting into those, looking at those creative aspects of you that I talked about with looking at characters and delving into that really narrative heavy aspect of creation. That has been a wonderful hotbed of ideas for me, and I would love to see you around if you want to join. It's super fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much again, and we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much again for inviting me. It was lovely talking with you.
Thanks again to Makenzie for joining us. It was a delight to be able to talk with her. And again, please do just check out her work if you're not aware of it already. You can find her on Twitter at Makenzie Lane DA. You can also find links to her content and her website up there on her Twitter. She's an awesome content creator, and it was a delight to have her on the show. Without further ado, let's head over to the wilds. Out here in the wilderness. For those of you familiar, The Wilds is the segment each week where we take a D&D 5th edition monster and talk about how we can tell stories with it, what kind of narratives it would be great to tell collaborative stories in. This week, though, we're going to be talking about creating our own monster, since creation is the theme of this episode. There are 4 different ways that you can do this in my mind, each with increasing levels of complexity all the way up to building your own stat block completely from scratch. But you don't have to feel like you have to do that. Oftentimes as DMs, especially starting out, we think we have to do all this legwork and come up with something completely creative and completely original, otherwise we're not a good dungeon master. We talked a little bit about that in the interview with Makenzie. Really, we don't have to do that. You can create a unique feel for your creature with much less work and much less concern for if your creature is going to end up being properly balanced. And the reason for this is that a lot of the feel of a monster is not in its stat block, it's in its description. It's in the dungeon master taking the particular flavor text of that creature and really expounding on it and giving this creature life. That's where a lot of the feel of a creature comes from. It's not just from the hard and fast mechanics. And so we're going to go over really quickly these 4 ways that you could create a creature. And I think this is going to explain how you can use just descriptors in order to create a really interesting and unique monster without actually doing so much legwork as to create a stat block on your own. Now, if you want to do that, if you're interested in doing that, absolutely. You can do a great job with that. In this segment today, I just want to talk about how we don't have to feel like it's necessary for us to do that in order to be good dungeon masters. And the first way of creating a unique monster is simply reflavoring. For this example, let's take a basic stat block. The cockatrice is a CR 1/2 small monstrosity that you can find on page 42 of the Monster Manual. It's a simple creature. It's got dark vision. It's got an armor class of 11, 27 hit points, a fly speed of 40 feet. Really not too much interesting about it except for its bite attack, which has a +3 to hit, only deals an average of 3 piercing damage, but it has a chance of beginning the petrification process and turn a PC to stone for 24 hours. They're really hideous looking. They look like a combination between a raptor and a bird and a bat. It's disgusting looking. And so it could be a little bit of an interesting creature to tell stories with. But so much of that feel, of that terror that you get whenever you see a bunch of these little nasty creatures flying at you, is in that description. That description that the monster manual uses of, it looks like a hideous hybrid of lizard, bird, and bat, to quote it directly. But nothing about the stat block cares about that description. You can describe it as a lovely bird. Describe its beautiful plumage. It can even tag along with the party for a while before it turns hostile at an opportune moment. And that could create an entirely different feel with the same stat block, because now it's this conniving little creature which is deceitful in the way that it looks. You can even describe it like a gargoyle. It doesn't even have to be a bird at all. It could be some little stone gargoyle creature which has the ability to turn things to stone and is trying to make things like itself. It could almost be a stat block for like a special gargoyle spawn or something like that. And all of that is changed just by changing the description. No stat block changes, nothing at all. Just a change in description changes the entire feel of the creature. And that's a way you can create an entirely unique and interesting monster which is useful for a particular encounter without undergoing the legwork of having to create an entire stat block from scratch. The second way you can build a creature is just to reskin it. And this means, to me, making minor changes to the types of abilities that a creature has, not changing any of the abilities dramatically, but changing things like the punch that a creature does and giving it claws. And so now it deals slashing damage instead of bludgeoning damage. Changing the fiery nature of a particular entity to one of ice. Perhaps now, instead of a creature taking damage with a melee attack like they do against an Azer or another type of entity with the heated body feature, where they're just so hot that making a melee attack against it causes you to take fire damage. Well, maybe they're just really, really cold, and doing the same thing causes you to get a little bit of frostbite. It doesn't change the amount of damage, it just changes the type. And doing that, again, can create a unique monster that will fit your need for a particular encounter without having to create a stat block from scratch. Now, if you do want to make a more unique stat block, you could do the third option, and that's to combine existing abilities. You're not making anything new necessarily, you're not starting from scratch, but you're picking abilities that you like and you combine them. Do you have a creature that you like, but you want it to feel more savage? Well, give it the reckless attack feature of the Minotaur or the Barbarian, and then describe, again, it all comes back to the description, describe the manner that it attacks as it's charging in, as having no regard for its own safety, just frothing at the mouth and recklessly attacking. If it can wield armor or weapons or objects, give it a magic item from the Dungeon Master's Guide. Like the Cockatrice, but want to make it a little dragon, we'll trade out that beak attack for the minor breath weapon of the Dragonborn race instead, and give it that ability to do 2d6 damage of whatever type you choose. By mixing and matching the different existing options, again, you can create a unique creature without having to start from scratch. But of course, the fourth option, if none of that works, you can just build your monster from scratch. But for me, this personally is a last resort, because so much can be accomplished just from changing the description, rather than coming up with entirely new abilities. So I'd encourage you to, before you spend time agonizing over building a specific stat block from scratch, just try changing your description. Try reflavoring it, reskinning it, or combining existing abilities, and that might save you a decent amount of work. I know it has for me in the past. Well, I think that'll just about wrap it up out here in the wilderness. I think it's time for me to head back to the tavern and get some refreshment. All right, we're here in the tavern. And as you know, the tavern is the segment each week where we take a specific plot hook and how you can potentially use it in your campaign. Today, though, we're going to be talking about generating your own plot hook. And honestly, this is a larger conversation, and one that if you're interested, we can have an entire episode on at some point in the future. But there are a couple of tips about creating plot hooks for a particular campaign or encounter or particular situation that you might find yourself in at the table, which I have discovered over the years. The first one is if you're in a particular region or a particular town or a particular wilderness, before you come up with a plot hook out of thin air, take a few minutes and really build out that setting in your head. What does it look like? What's there? If it's a town, what type of businesses are there? Is there a particular industry that is prevalent in the town? Perhaps there's a thriving barrel industry or a winery that is a huge prominent fixture of the town. If you're in a wilderness, perhaps there is a specific type of tree that's recurring. Think of specific unique features and then think, what could go wrong? Because so many plot hooks are at their core, something has gone wrong from the status quo. An alchemist needs more reagents before they can make a potion. Somebody has had something stolen from them and you need to get it back. Something has happened catastrophically like a sinkhole or a collapse or a monster attack and you have to go solve it as a party. So many plot hooks at their core are something has gone wrong and we have to fix it. Well, once you've taken the brief legwork of thinking about what is actually at this location, and then you think about what could have gone wrong, well, at that point, you've got yourself a plot hook right there. Because you could say, okay, all right, well, there's this barrel industry in this town. Well, what could go wrong? Well, maybe their shipment of wood in from the next town over got delayed. It hasn't shown up yet. Well, there's a plot hook for your adventurers. If they interact with that industry, now all of a sudden they've got an adventure to figure out why the shipment hasn't gotten there. So try to think about what's there and what could have gone wrong. The second thing which I wanted to share really briefly before we wrap up today is, like we've mentioned several times throughout this podcast, you don't have to feel like you have to be completely and totally original. It is completely okay to look at the Dungeon Master's Guide, which has whole chapters about plot hooks and encounters and adventures, and it has tables for you to roll on in order to get good plot hooks. It is perfectly okay to consult those in order to get ideas. There are places online you can go to that will generate plot hooks for you. You can look at those, and odds are they're not going to fit exactly what you want in your particular setting or your particular situation. But it can spark a really good thought process, which can really help create an interesting and unique story which you wouldn't have come up with otherwise. And there's nothing wrong with getting ideas from those places. There's nothing wrong with getting ideas from your players either. If your players have a really good idea, or if they start going down a particular path, follow it. Follow them down that path, and then build out, perhaps before the next session, okay, this path I hadn't considered, but what would this look like? Looking at those ideas can really just help spark your thought process and generate a really great story. But of course, There's a ton more we could talk about creation, not just plot hooks, but monsters and all the things we talked about with Makenzie, and we'll of course have to revisit this topic at some point down the road in the podcast. But for today, I think that's about going to wrap up the episode. Thanks very much for listening from all of us here at Plot Hooks. I'm Samuel. Thanks from Matt, Mike, Dave, Steve, Zach, Becca, and podcast Pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.